We have been talking about the Sermon on the Mount, and gonna probably spend a few more Sunday nights there. I don't know. I'm not really getting in a hurry, so we got plenty of time until the Lord comes again or something happens. So I guess we're all right. And it's a tough read, isn't it? And it challenges us on a lot of levels to be sometimes maybe bigger than we think we can be. And I think that's a truth in God, is that God expects us to be bigger than we can be, you know? And sometimes that's a pretty tall order. You know, we talked about this idea beyond the law, started talking about that, where the Jews had the law, right? Law of Moses, and they thought, you know, if we can just live that law, keep that law, that's all we got to do, you know? Just got to keep the law. It says don't murder, don't go murder anybody. It says, you know, don't commit adultery, then just don't physically commit adultery. If it says, you know, we just got to keep it. And Jesus says, oh, that's not true. Jesus said it's not about the law, it's about your heart. It's about where you are in your heart, right? Where you're going to be. And so he starts with, you shall not commit murder, which seems, you know, that I can probably do that. I mean, I hope I can. For my whole life. I hope I'm not going to go murder anybody. Not planning on it. Haven't done it in 60 years. You know, don't think I'm going to do it now. But I mean, that seems like a pretty good one, easy one to keep. I can do that, right? I mean, I can do that. But you know, Jesus says it's not just about that. You know, we talked about this last Sunday night. It's about not hating each other, not being angry with each other. That's a little harder for me to do that. You know, and he makes a statement, and of course we talked about this last Sunday. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I did want to bring up a point. He makes a statement we often talk about where he talks about this idea that says, you good for nothing shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. Whoever says you fool shall be good enough to go into the fiery hell. And I said, you know, this is, I think, one of them places in the Sermon on the Mount where you look at it and you're like, you know, well, that seems harsh. I mean, what does that mean, you fool? Well, the word in the Greek kind of means you good for nothing. Basically, you're mental, you know, you're good for nothing. But Jesus used that word. He used it in Matthew 23. He used it a couple verses after this. He used it at the end of the Sermon on the Mount where he said, the foolish man will build his house upon the sand. So Jesus used that word. He says, you fools and blind men, which is more important. So Jesus actually used that word. So, you know, there is a righteous anger. There is a righteousness that can be obtained. And I think that's important. And Jesus even illustrated that by using that exact word. He says, if you use that word, you're in danger. Don't use it wrong, right? Don't use it in the wrong way. Don't use it in the wrong context. So it gives a little contextual basis to what's going on. But here he says, he heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. And that, in the Jewish thought, that was the physical act. And you have to remember that Jesus was speaking to this audience, and this audience contained Jews. And in Jewish school of thought at that time, there were two great rabbis, Shammai and Hillel, and they both had a different view on what it meant in Deuteronomy when it says you can give your wife a certificate of divorce. One of them said, listen, it means that she actually has to be caught in adultery. In other words, she has to be caught in the act. In that case, you can give her a certificate of divorce, you can divorce her. The other rabbi says, oh, no. If she burns your food more than once, you know, you can give her a certificate of divorce. In other words, he was very liberal on it. Anything she did to displease you, you could give her a certificate of divorce and send her out. So Jesus is talking to this audience with these two views. And Jesus says, but once again, it's in your heart. He says, whoever looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, it's not the idea of just looking at a woman and saying, well, she's a good-looking woman. It's the idea of looking at a woman to lust after a woman. In other words, looking at her with the idea that you want to pursue it. And Jesus goes on to say, this is so important. The right eye and the right hand in that society were very important. Well, they are in our society too. Were more important than the left. And Jesus goes on to say that it would be better to mutilate yourself, basically, than to break this. In other words, this is so important that whatever it takes to keep you from doing this, that's what you need to do. You know, the truth is, with adultery, generally, is a process. It's not like in the movies where people just see each other and throw themselves after each other. Adultery is a process. It's where there's an attraction, and maybe they're giving that person something they're not getting at home. They're giving them self-worth or value, or they're being encouraging, or maybe they're in a discouraging household. And eventually, that turns into something more. Jesus says, listen, you have to stop it before it starts. It's important. It's so important that it would be better, Jesus says, to mutilate yourself than to allow that to occur. Jesus said adultery starts in the heart. Not the physical act, but it starts in the heart. And then Jesus goes on to say, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of chastity, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, it's a verb in the Greek, not a noun. And that's important because it means it's a sin. So if divorce is a sin, we're all right with that. We should be all right with that. But it's a forgivable sin. In other words, there was always this idea of a continuing state. In other words, she continues in adultery, or he continues in adultery. But it's not that usage here. It's not a noun here. It's a verb. And so basically it means that you made him do it. So there's a point. There's a sin involved. But once again, it's not the unforgivable sin. But Jesus, of course, discourages it, doesn't he? He says it's not something that we should do. But yet it happens. And it's something that we as Christians have to deal with. We have to deal with it in our lives, in our families. We have to deal with it in the church. But we want to try to avoid it. And I think that's what Jesus is saying. At all costs, we need to try to avoid it. And sometimes that requires effort on both parts. You can't make somebody love you. You can't make somebody stay. We all know all the implications of this. But Jesus puts up an ideal here. And he says it's important that we try to abide by that ideal. You've heard it said, the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows. And in the Jewish society, a vow was important because a vow was unbreakable. Jephthah vowed the first thing that walked out of his house when he won the battle, and that was his daughter. Jephthah was unable to break the vow. Now, there was in the Old Testament a way to break a rash vow or a vow made in haste, but generally, vows were considered unbreakable. When you vowed it, you had to honor it. But what they did was they said they made vows by different levels. It's kind of like you and as a kid. And you said we'd do a pinky swear, right? Or we'd do a step on your crack, break your mother's back swear. But if you was really serious about it when I was a kid, you did a blood swear, right? You pricked your fingers. We wouldn't do that today because we know that's not the way to do it. But when I was a kid, we didn't know that. So you'd do a blood swear when I was a kid, because that meant you couldn't break it. So we had these different levels, right? And if you was ever a kid, you go, well, it doesn't count because I have my fingers crossed behind my back. I mean, you know all the things we do to break a vow. And that's what they did. So they said, well, if I vow by the altar, if I vow by the temple, then that doesn't really count, I can break that. But if I vow by God, that's unbreakable. Jesus said, listen, why do you vow at all? Your yes should be yes and your no should be no. In other words, whatever you say, that's what you should do, Jesus said. There shouldn't be a way to break a vow or a way not to get around what you say that you're going to do. It ought to just be yes or no. That's what it ought to be. We shouldn't have to qualify our answers as Christians. What we say, our word should be our bond, right? What we say is what we should do. And then Jesus says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And that is an Old Testament principle. And God did that for a reason. God did that because they lived in a world that wasn't equal or fair. We live in a world that's not equal and fair. Theirs really wasn't equal or fair. They lived in a world that if I was a wealthy guy and you wasn't, and you did something to me, I'd just have you killed. Didn't matter what you did. Trespassing my property, off with his head, right? And so God came along and he says, no, you can't do that, right? The punishment has to fit the crime. If you take somebody's eye, then you ought to lose an eye. If you knock somebody's tooth out in a fight, then maybe you ought to knock your tooth out, The punishment ought to fit the crime. And that was really good in that society because they lived in a world where that wasn't the case. Punishments didn't fit the crime. So Jesus really made that good. He made this kind of a righteous idea here. But Jesus says, and this is one we struggle with, isn't it? To be slapped on the right cheek by a right-handed person, you got to think about this with me for a minute. To be slapped on the right cheek with a right-handed person was a backhanded slap, right? And in that society, that was an insult. In other words, it was like you saw in the old, like Three Musketeers, where they took their gloves and slapped them on the cheek. It was that type of thing. If you slapped them on the right, that was an insult. It wasn't talking about beating somebody up here, not talking about physical abuse. We're more or less talking about an insult. And he says here, if they do that to you, then just give him the other one also. In other words, don't repay an insult for an insult. Don't repay a wrong with a wrong. But then he says, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat. So in that society, you weren't allowed to take somebody's outer cloak, because that was how they slept. That was their pillow. It was their blanket. It was like taking our house. You could take their inner cloak. You could take their inner shirt, but you weren't allowed to take their outer garment. Matter of fact, you remember at the cross, when Jesus was crucified, they cast lots for the outer garment because it had such value. It was woven in one piece without a seam. Outer garments were important, and you weren't allowed to do it, and you couldn't even use it as collateral on a loan. You couldn't even use your outer garment as collateral because, like I said, that was kind of like taking your house. But here, Jesus says, listen, if they want it, then have them take it both. Whoever forced you to go 1 mile, go 2. That was a Roman thing. The Roman army at that time could conscript anybody off the street. They had all this armor. They had their sword, their shield, their helmet, their stuff they put on their shins, had all this armor that was heavy. And a Roman soldier could come up to anybody and say, listen, Rex, you got to carry my armor for 1 mile. And you had to do it. That was kind of Roman law. So you'd have to gather up all this heavy armor and pack it for 1 mile for this soldier. And Jesus said, but if he wants you to go, if he asks you to do that, then go 2. Go the extra, right? He says, give to him who asks you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. We struggle with it because we think, well, that's kind of all-inclusive. And how does that work? Well, it works because among Christians, we have responsibility to one another. It doesn't say to give everything to him who asks. It says to give, right? It doesn't give us that command. Jesus is saying here that if it's in our ability to help, we need to help, and we should help the extra, right, as Christians. You and I should help. We should help to the best of our ability. When I broke my back, I had somebody here in this church come to me and offer me money and said, you can take this money and you never have to pay me back. And I didn't take it, but I've never forgot it in my life. Never forgot it. I broke my back. 3 days later, the guy, Virgil, that worked for me, he broke his neck. He was paralyzed. I told my kids, I took my kids outside of the hospital, and I said, I don't know how we're going to make it. And somebody offered me a pretty good sized chunk of money. And that's not the first time that's happened for me here. And I've never forgot that. The truth is that we have the ability to help somebody that needs it, then we should do that. But on the other hand, as a Christian, we should be, I think of the proper word, we should be conscientious about what we accept. I think Christians helping Christians is the most wonderful thing on earth. Because to truthfully be a Christian, helping a true Christian, nobody's going to come away from that wrong. Not going to happen. Now, if it's somebody that's not a real Christian, if it's somebody that doesn't have that heart, then things can go south, and I've seen that happen. But a true Christian helping a true Christian will never go wrong, ever. And I think that's what Jesus is saying. And I think when we give help and we get help, I think we pay that forward. I think we're able to help maybe somebody that needs it. Anyway, I've always thought a lot about this passage because I think we take it like letting people take advantage of us. But if you're truthfully helping this person that's truthfully a Christian, and you're truthfully a Christian, nobody's going to get taken advantage of in that situation. It's not going to happen. Jesus is right. You see, you and I, we take it like anybody in the world that comes up and says, oh, give me whatever, give me all your stuff. We should have to give it to them. That's really not the passage. That's really not the passage. Jesus was correct in what he said. He says, you've heard it said, you shall love your enemy, love your neighbor, and hate your enemy. It never, in the Old Testament, ever says to hate your enemy. But Jesus says, you've heard it said. You know, all my life I heard it said that cleanliness was next to godliness and idle hands are the devil's workshop, right? You know, I heard it said. I really believed it. And as I got older, I really thought it was in the Bible, and I couldn't find it. But I tried, because I figured if Granny said it was right, it was probably right, and I needed just to find it. But those things weren't in there. But I heard it said. I believed it. So just because they heard it said doesn't mean that it was really there. Well, it's not really in the Old Testament, but that's what they heard. Hate your enemy. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And didn't Jesus get involved in that conversation when he talked about the neighbor and the Good Samaritan? Remember the beginning of that story, the Good Samaritan? The lawyer was questioning him. He said, what's the greatest commandment, right? Love your Lord your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the lawyer, wishing to test him, says what? He says, who is my neighbor? And Jesus said, well, let me tell you a story about a Samaritan. And at the end of the story, Jesus says, well, who's the man's neighbor? And the lawyer says, the one who helped him. Jesus says your neighbor is whoever is around you. It's whoever is. The neighbor was the one who helped him. The neighbor is the one who responded, even though to the Jew, that wasn't really his neighbor. But Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. To love your enemies. I believe that's the greatest commandment, the greatest thing ever, because I think that breaks the cycle of hate in our lives. To pray for those who are against us, so that you may be sons of your Father. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Jesus said God's blessings flow on everyone. God's blessings flow on those who are good and those who are evil. Right? The sun rises, the rain falls on the good, it falls on the evil. The sun rises on the good, the sun sets on the evil. He said if God blesses everyone, then why shouldn't we bless everyone? Right? Why should we hold it back? If God doesn't hold the rain back, God doesn't hold the sun back, why should you and I hold back? For if you love those that love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore you are to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. You know, the idea of loving our enemies, that's something that we struggle with in this idea. How can I love somebody who hates me? How can I love somebody who wants to do harm against me, who wants to do bad things to me? Well, the answer is that that's what Jesus did. I mean, Jesus went to the cross, right? He died for people who hated him. I mean, that's the sad truth of the cross. Jesus hung on that cross at the hands of people that he wanted to save, and they hated him. Jesus said, you can do great things through Christ, do great things to God, even to those who are your enemies. You know, the Sermon on the Mount was never easy. Never easy. These things are not easy. But God's going to judge, according to the Scripture, God's going to judge the intent of our heart, isn't he? The intent of our heart. You know, I had a conversation with somebody. I guess I said something I shouldn't have said. I do that sometimes. I really didn't think I said anything I wasn't supposed to say in my defense. But they heard it to be something I shouldn't have said, I guess. And they sent me a message, and I sent it back, and I said, you know me well enough, you know my heart. You know? And what you heard, even though you might have heard something, maybe you heard it in a way, but you know that isn't was never the intent of what I was saying. you know. I mean, as Christians, you and I, we have to give each other the benefit of the doubt, don't we? We've got to give each other the benefit of the doubt. I mean, if I hear you say something and it sounds out of character for you, then I know your heart. I know that it probably was, or maybe I didn't hear it right, or maybe we need to talk about it, but I'm not going to judge you for it because I know who you are, you know? We have to treat each other better than we treat the world. We do. We have to opt out of things. Maybe that's not the way to put it, but we have to love each other to the point that we always think the best even in the worst, right? Until we know different. We always have to think the best even in the worst until we know different. Because you and I, we're going to spend eternity together. And if we can't get along here for however many years we have, how are we going to get along forever? Right? You know, we're practicing, I think. That's how I look at it. I'm practicing down here so that when I get up there, maybe I'll have some of it figured out, I hope. Right? Because God's given me some chances here to make mistakes. And all of us to make mistakes. And maybe we'll get it figured out before we get to heaven. And maybe when we get to heaven, maybe we'll be better. I hope. So maybe that's what Jesus was telling us. To treat each other better. To love each other more. And to be kind. Maybe that's what he's saying. I don't know. Take it for what you will. Thank you for your time. If we can help you in any way, won't you let it be known while we stand and sing.